Everybody, welcome to the final HMEI Faculty Seminar of the Spring 2024 series. We have had a fantastic year, 7 up to now fantastic talks, and now we get to close it up with Professor Kevon Rhiney. Kevon is an associate professor at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, also my alma mater, right? So you know he's good. But sort of for the past year, we have had the real pleasure and privilege of having Kevon be here with us as the Barron Visiting Professor in the Environmental Humanities. Kevon has taught classes that have brought students together and engaged them with concepts, with evidence, with ideas in a way that you can just see the way that they've sort of bubbled up and gotten so much out of it. Very grateful for that. Kevon has organized 2 fantastic events, one in the fall, one just recently in the spring. Very grateful for that. They were really fantastic opportunities for us to engage with some fairly deep ideas about how to live in this world with the multiple challenges, environmental, social, ethical, all simultaneously. And so before, and Kevon's had a lot of accomplishments, but I'm not going to go into those. Mostly I want to just say that I've found it just wonderful to have him here as a colleague, and not just me, but I've heard from students in the sciences and engineering, in the humanities, and just how sort of welcoming and open he has been. And this is really what we want when we have a visiting professor here, somebody that will help sort of expand our community. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I'm so excited that Kevon is only up the street at Rutgers. And so I'm looking forward to seeing much more of him in the years to come. So with that, I'll let Kevon take the floor and give us his stuff. Thank you.
And I have not taken up the invitation to play soccer yet, but I promise I will turn up one of these days. Yeah, it's been a pleasure being here. I can't believe the year is almost done. I just want to take the opportunity to thank Gabe, Kathy, and the amazing staff here at HMEI, and many colleagues that I've had the privilege and pleasure of having very interesting and stimulating conversations on topics that are very dear to my heart. And so, being in this space has been really amazing, and it's been a great opportunity, and I will certainly cherish the kind of connections that I've built while I've been here. So I want to, and Gabe, you set me up. You said 7 amazing talks this semester so far. So there's a lot of pressure. But anyways, I hope to share some thoughts, some insights, some lessons that I've learned over the past 15 or so years, having done research in the Caribbean, particularly with smallholder farming communities. And so this talk is kind of dedicated to the main ethos or mantra that drives the research that I do, which is really focused around community-based scholarship. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the upcoming event being led by my colleague, and hopefully my new friend. I'm going to refer to him as my new friend because we've definitely made some good connections while I've been here. Dr. Nathan Jesse and his colleague Ryan Juskus, who is going to be sharing their own work this afternoon on community-engaged scholarship and environmental justice. And I guess there's another reception that's going to follow. That's one other note. I've benefited so much from the food here. This was amazing in terms of this, how you guys really cultivate community, which is something that I realize is actually missing in a lot of places, and we shouldn't take that for granted. So in terms of my talk, I am going to kind of just go through providing first a brief overview of the climate scientific basis for adaptation in the Caribbean, and I'm going to talk briefly around adaptation as a concept. And then I'm going to kind of segue into talking about some of the opportunities and challenges for translating climate science into community adaptation work. And then I'm going to focus on Jamaica, right, which is where I've been doing a lot of my work over the past few years, to kind of set the broader political economy that's informed the work that I do. And then I'm going to take a few minutes to I'm not going to go in any great detail. I'm just going to talk about 2 case studies that have taken place in Jamaica to kind of draw some broader lessons, to think about some of the methodological challenges in translating climate science in community adaptation work, but also some of the innovations that I've seen over the past few years as well. So the Caribbean is regarded as a climate change hotspot, and global climate change is projected to increase the vulnerability of the region to climate-related hazards, such as droughts, hurricanes, and also a lot of this will be impacted by rising sea levels as well. And these threats are expected to increase in the future due to the inability of the global community to meet critical global emissions reduction targets. So the Earth, as we already know, has already warmed by roughly 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And based on recent projections, the world will likely breach the plus 1.5 degrees Celsius degree threshold by the early 2030s, which is way earlier than was previously projected. And it's now projected that we are well on our way to surpass 2 degrees Celsius well before the end of this century. And of course, as you can imagine, this will have serious implications for island communities, particularly small island states that are low-lying and located in regions that are prone to natural hazards or extreme climate events. And a lot of this vulnerability is linked to underlying characteristics, right? So Caribbean SIDS are especially vulnerable to climate change owing to their small geographic size. You know, a single hurricane can impact an entire island. We've seen this over the past few years. Hurricane Ivan in 2004 destroyed 90% of Grenada's agricultural sector. The economic burden is catastrophic. That country was set back by more than several decades, actually, when you look at the ways in which the hurricane impacted its gross domestic product for the following years, but also the fact that, you know, when you impact an agricultural sector, it takes years and years to recover, and so a lot of that. A lot of the losses that's linked to these events get lost in translation. It's kind of hard to really put a money value or any form of statistical value to the kind of impacts that many islands face when impacted by a hurricane. And a lot of that is linked to their small geographic size, but also for Caribbean SIDS, you know, they're located in a region that is prone to a range of climate-related hazards. It's located in a hurricane belt, so every single year the region is kind of placed at high alert, because of that location. And what we know from the climate science is that, you know, these hurricanes are expected to get more intense, and of course, one single impact from a hurricane is more than enough to set a country back in terms of its economic trajectory. There are also other characteristics, such as high population densities, the kind of high concentration of infrastructure and settlement along coastal areas. And many of these countries suffer from what we refer to as a coastal squeeze, where unlike here in the US, where you can talk about planned coastal retreat, you can imagine in a small island context where land is not in abundance. Many of these countries are, are forced to literally utilize their coastal zones, and they just simply don't have the wiggling room to even think about other options such as coastal retreat. So they're kind of placed in this very precarious situation. And many of these islands rely on climate-sensitive industries like agriculture and tourism. They have very narrow economies and low kind of institutional capacities. It's important to point out the kind of climate injustice that's linked to this as well, right? Because these countries have contributed the least to global greenhouse gas emissions. When you take all of the populations of small island states, it comes to around 65 million people globally. That's less than 1% of the global population. And so they experience this kind of double exposure or double vulnerability, right? Where they've they've contributed the least to this crisis, but they also have the least capacity to respond to the shocks and the stresses that's kind of linked to a changing climate system. So in terms of the Caribbean, adaptation is a very important policy discussion. It's a very important kind of topic in terms of thinking about the future, right? Its mitigation is obviously important, but as you can realize, for a region that is so vulnerable to climate change, adaptation is a necessary policy response. So when you kind of think about the broad context that situates the kind of vulnerability that the region is placed in, there is this like a clear priority that one has to give to thinking about questions around how do we safeguard vulnerable populations to climate-induced shocks. And given the current environment, we expect that the impacts from these climate-induced shocks will increase in the future. So loss and damage, adaptation, these are like very big priority areas for many small island developing states. And when I talk about adaptation, I'm really thinking about the kind of proactive measures that are put in place to safeguard vulnerable populations from climate-induced threats and shocks. And this diagram gives a pretty decent illustration of what this could look like. And of course, adaptation differs from coping strategies, which in many cases are more reactive strategies, right? Adaptation speak to more kind of proactive, deliberate actions that are put in place to safeguard populations from climate-induced shocks. And I also want to point out that, when you think about adaptation is not a straightforward process. We've seen where adaptation can be a very messy, multilinear, iterative, and also a contested process, right? And I'm thinking about work that's been done by people like Robin Leshenko and Karen O'Brien, that have kind of looked at double exposure, for instance. And kind of one of the key lessons coming out of that type of scholarship is that even some of the most well-intentioned adaptation efforts can cause harm, right? And that in many cases, the populations that tend to be left out of these adaptation, the benefits from these adaptation efforts tend to be populations that are already poor and already marginalized, right? And there's always this kind of risk of maladaptation resulting from poorly planned adaptation efforts that do not take into account underlying social and economic factors, right? And this is kind of where I want to kind of situate this talk in terms of thinking about the messiness of adaptation and thinking about the need to focus on, kind of local, social, cultural, institutional context, and thinking about how climate science can be used to kind of help inform adaptation work that is just adaptation work that takes account of underlying power structures. And of course, what's if you read between the lines, is also this fear that if we're not aware of these underlying power structures and inequalities, climate science can actually do more harm than good, right? Because, you know, in one of the biggest challenges with adaptation work is that it often reproduces or preserves the status quo, and that naturally or inherently produces winners and losers. And in most cases, you know, the groups that tend to benefit the most from those efforts are groups that were already in a position to capitalize on those opportunities. And so when you think about community adaptation work, why that's important is that we do take into account those kind of underlying power structures. And we also kind of center questions around power and justice in the work that we do. So when you think about adaptation, there are obviously different types of adaptation pathways that one can take. And within the literature, there are largely two broad kind of categorizations of adaptation. The first, which is probably the most common probably and the easiest, is incremental adaptation, which really thinks about, you know, again, proactive measures that doesn't necessarily do anything to a system, right? It works within the system. It focuses on the implementation of activities that allows that system to be more efficient. So you can think about irrigation systems. You can think about, you know, changes to the timing of crops in terms of when you the kind of cropping cycles and so on. And this is extremely important. However, there is enough studies that have shown that this is not enough, right? Especially if you think about the Caribbean, that from the context that under a warming climate, a lot of the activities that are now sufficient and adequate will lose their effectiveness over time. And so it does require a kind of a radical rethinking of adaptation work. And in many cases, this requires addressing the root causes of vulnerability. It sometimes requires shifting an entire system. And one example could be moving completely from crops to forested systems or agroforestry, or rethinking an entire kind of land use function itself. And so in terms of, I'm using this kind of heuristic way of thinking about adaptation as a form of way of kind of framing the case studies that I'll be talking about in a short while, right? And so kind of tied to this is really kind of thinking about how, when we think about climate science work and how it informs community adaptation efforts, is how we can kind of undertake these projects, bearing in mind the complexity of adaptation. And you know, what you've seen is that there is this kind of growing interest and emphasis on kind of promoting evidence-based decision making. And this has been, I've been placed in a very strategic position over the years because of the projects that I've been involved with. Many of these projects have been working within like these broad interdisciplinary teams with climate scientists, plant scientists, and I tend to be the kind of, you know, the annoying social scientists in these projects that ask a lot of annoying questions, but important questions, right? In terms of, you know, to what end are we kind of producing these data, or the kind of technologies that we're promoting? How do these technologies, how are they being taken up by the populations that we are targeting? And also kind of thinking about which segments of the population can take on these new technologies, and not just taking this very kind of ahistorical, kind of apolitical approach, that in many ways can be used and weaponized against vulnerable communities, right? And one kind of clear example of this is, over the years, this kind of rhetoric that smallholder farmers are least interested or least capable of taking on new technologies. And there's been a lot of that discussion at policy levels. And what a lot of these studies are showing is that it's not that smallholder farmers are incapable of adopting these new technologies, but that these new technologies are mapping onto these like existing kind of landscapes that unless you understand how these landscapes are shaping these farmers' capacity to take up these new technologies, you will simply be just reinscribing the same form of inequalities that have existed before, right? And so this is kind of where my work is kind of focused. And so there's a lot of focus on crop niche models or climate information services to kind of think about the ways in which these can inform adaptation decisions. And one of the challenges that we've seen is that, especially in small island contexts, it's very difficult to really carry out these projects because you're operating in a landscape of data deficiency. There's a lot of like uncertainties, even with the models that we're using. Many of these models are operating within different assumptions and scenarios and using different parameters. And of course, a lot of these models do not take into account the wide array of processes that impact the farming industry and the agricultural sector. And of course, the question of indigenous or local knowledge and how climate scientific research can better integrate local knowledge, local indigenous knowledge in the kind of knowledge that we produce is also something that has come up many times in a number of the projects that I've been involved with. So for the most part, a lot of these models have not account for local knowledge. And a lot of the farming communities that I work in, farmers are obviously making adjustments to their farming systems based on their own observations of what is going on. But a lot of these efforts are best described as coping, as opposed to they're not necessarily proactive kind of initiatives where farmers have a kind of a clear idea in terms of what's the threat and how these actions will necessarily reap potential outcomes, advantageous outcomes. But in fact, many of these like initiatives that you're seeing on the ground are initiatives that are kind of almost like knee-jerk reactions, even though these farmers are very much attuned to the changes that are taking place. So in some ways, I think there's a lot of opportunities for really bridging that gap between the climate science that lacks the sort of data that's needed to kind of produce robust models. And on the farming side, the need to have the type of scientific basis to support the type of observations and experimentations that are already taking place at the farming level. So I want to then just kind of shift gears a bit to kind of look at the Jamaican context. And this is, of course, where my two case studies are going to be kind of situated, right? So the first thing to point out is that the agricultural sector in Jamaica is impacted by a whole range of different processes that inform its vulnerability to climate change. At the institutional level, there is the legacies of colonialism, that what you have is this kind of dual agrarian system where traditionally most of the state's resources have always been focused on plantation agriculture at the expense of domestic agriculture, right? And so if you look at the kind of policy landscape, there's always been a focus of producing foods that we do not consume on the island. and consuming food that we do not produce, right? So you see this very kind of weird, and it's actually quite common across many former colonies, where there is this clear divide between plantation crops like banana, cocoa, coffee, and other kind of more ground produce and so on that is grown mostly by smallholder farmers. And also the agricultural sector suffers from its own challenges, right? In Jamaica, the agricultural ministry is one of the least funded. There is a huge gap between the agricultural extension support and the number of farmers that require extension support. And in many cases, what you find is that smallholder farmers are forced to operate on their own, right? When there is an impact, the state might provide basic relief efforts, but they're never enough really to account for the damages that smallholder farmers face. There's also the kind of socioeconomic side, where the majority of farmers in Jamaica are smallholder farmers. I would say roughly 75% of farmers in Jamaica operate on lands less than 2 hectares, and all of that combined accounts for less than 30% of the total agrarian land. And a lot of these farms are open field, labor intensive, rain-fed cropping systems, so they're very much reliant on the kind of seasonal distribution of rainfall and so on. So any kind of changes that take place within the climate system impacts them. Also, on the biological side, as kind of the physical side, as much as Jamaica is a relatively small country, actually smaller than New Jersey, believe it or not, it's a very complex system. It has a very complex geography. And what you can see here is just this kind of seasonal distribution in rainfall. This is the Jamaican Blue Mountain region, which is the highest region on the island. You kind of have this high concentration of rainfall here. But if you look at the distribution across the island, a lot of the region experience a kind of a rainfall deficit. Especially in recent years, you kind of seen this kind of decline in annual rainfall distribution. But the point here, I guess the main point I'm trying to make is that it's highly uneven, despite the size of the island. And you can see this like huge difference between the kind of eastern side of the island and like the southwestern side of the island. The two examples that I'm going to talk about briefly is kind of located in different sections of the island. The first is going to be looking at the southern section, which is in St. Elizabeth, which is actually located in a rain shadow region. And then the other example is going to be along the Jamaican Blue Mountain region, which is where they grow coffee and bananas. And so it's a completely different agroecological system. And I want to kind of, for these two case studies, pay attention to the local context in farming adaptation work. And it's going to be animated by these two big questions, right? So what are the challenges and opportunities for translating climate science and adaptation efforts? And what role can community engaged and participatory methods play in bridging this divide? So the first case study is really looking at work that's been done in southern St. Elizabeth, which again is located in a kind of a rain shadow region. And one of the things that's quite obvious from the kind of more than 10, 15 years of doing work in the area is that drought has been a problem and will continue to be a major problem for farming systems in the region. What is kind of interesting here, though, is that even within this very small region, there are fairly significant differences in terms of agroclimatic conditions, with communities located in the most southern region being some of the most driest communities, while communities located in kind of upper reaches actually experiencing slightly different agroclimatic conditions, particularly in terms of rainfall distribution. So even within this small space, you will see kind of differences across this region in terms of rainfall distribution. And so there's been studies from Doug Gamble. He's based at University of North Carolina, and other members have been kind of involved in that project for the past 10 or so, 15 years. And this has been a really interesting project in that they've tried to match farmer perception to actual hydrometeorological data that they've collected on 15 or so farms located in the region. And the idea was to kind of see if the farmers' perception of drought was mapping on to the weather record that they were collecting over a 2-year period. And so they also did interviews with these farmers. This was an NSF-funded project. And of course, they were interested in kind of thinking about how perception might change across these different agroecological zones as well, and then kind of matching that again to the kind of the data that they were recording. And they literally set up rainfall gauges and so on these selected farms, and they worked with these farmers over the 2-year period to record the data. They had someone working with, each community had a volunteer that they trained in terms of how to collect the data and so forth. So they had 2 full years of hydrometeorological data. And they matched this up with the farmers' own perception of drought. And what they found, and these publications I can definitely share with folks if you're interested, is that the farmers were able to actually identify changes in seasonal patterns, even though it was a fairly short period of time for the study. But as you can see in terms of their data here, in terms of rainfall distribution for the period, it matched almost perfectly with farmers' perception of the dry and rainy season, right, in terms of what they were experiencing. So in periods where farmers say that it was rainy, obviously kind of matched with the record itself. Periods where farmers said it was dry, again, it kind of matched with the record that they had. The other interesting thing to point out here, again, if you look at this graphic, is the kind of farmer perception for instance, drought here matches again perfectly with the kind of distribution in terms of rainfall. You're seeing the same thing here with average temperature, which you would expect to see higher rates of evapotranspiration in moments where you have higher temperatures. So again, that kind of matched perfectly. And if you look at this point here with average soil moisture, again, you see this kind of inverse relationship, where soil moisture went down, farmers actually identified that as a kind of a drought period as well. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that, farmers aren't, they aren't these passive agents. They're obviously observing these changes that's taking place, right? So there's ample opportunity for kind of capitalizing on this local knowledge and using this to kind of help to ground truth a lot of the climate science work that's being done. So there's obviously clear opportunities there. The challenge, of course, is that a lot of these projects are only short term. So this was done, but again, it was dependent on NSF funding. That project has now ended. And I think that there's been an amazing opportunity to really kind of build on this lesson, to build out a greater kind of model in terms of building on local knowledge and using that to kind of develop more robust climate models. The other thing that kind of came out as well is, in terms of looking at this example, is how this changed across space, right? So for farmers that said yes, they experienced a drought, you'd see that there's a greater frequency in the kind of more southern communities versus communities that were kind of located further up in terms of altitude. Again, that kind of shows that even within this, like the changes that you're seeing across agroecological zones, that farmers were picking up these changes as well. So the big takeaway here is that clearly the local context matters. Time scales also matter as well, temporal dynamics. And there's this big question in terms of which time scales matter the most, which challenges us in terms of how we think about climate models as well. Because a lot of these farmers, were really focused on the timing of the dry season. They were very focused on more like everyday kind of experiences, which in some ways is interesting in terms of how it forces us to rethink drought, right? Because drought here is more than simply a deficit of rainfall, right? In some ways, it's the ways in which these farmers were kind of reacting or interpreting the drought was more kind of multifaceted, right? They kind of link to their kind of everyday experience, and that kind of shaped the way in which they kind of think of drought, which is not new. We know within the literature that there are different ways of thinking about drought, but one of the things that really come out here is a kind of the ways in which the farmers' own kind of practices and perceptions, how they're observing their plants, or how they're observing their soils, was extremely important in terms of how they were perceiving drought. And that might also have some very useful lessons for us to learn in terms of how we can better tailor the kind of climate information services that we provide to farmers that can be more attuned to how they think about drought, right? And then I'm gonna just move quickly through the second case study. And this was a study that was done with the IRI from University of Columbia. Lisa Goddard, who sadly passed away a few years ago, was the lead on this. We worked with folks from University of Arizona, and at the time I was actually based at the University of the West Indies when I was working on this project. And it really was based on the coffee leaf rust disease, which had emerged in 2012, had wiped out like almost 30% of coffee trees within 2 years. And it was obviously causing a major catastrophe for the coffee industry. And so we were kind of brought in to develop an early warning system for the coffee leaf rust disease, right? So the idea was that this is a fungal disease. It's driven by the pathogen Hemilia vastatrix. It's been around for centuries, right? It's actually kind of believed that it's what led Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, to switch from coffee to tea because that disease had wiped out all of their coffee industry in the late 1800s, and that forced them to switch from coffee to tea. So it's been around for a long time, and it's particularly, at least the race of leaf rust that's been impacting the global coffee industry is particularly attuned to impacting the Arabica variety, right? So, and that's a variety that we all love. That's a variety that we grow mostly. It's a great tasting coffee versus Robusta, as the name suggests, that it's a way more robust, resilient variety of coffee, but it doesn't have the kind of taste profile that we prefer. And so the kind of Jamaican industry was kind of placed in this very, very complex situation where, being an industry that is, the Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee is one of the most expensive coffees in the world. 90% of it goes to Japan. It's well over $60 a pound for Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee. They don't want to play around with that brand. They don't want to switch out of the variety that they're growing in Jamaica. Unlike places like Colombia that has switched to hybrid varieties, Brazil has also done so. The Jamaican government wanted to take a different approach, which was, let's help our farmers to live with the disease by developing these like early warning systems that can help them to make more timely, more informed decisions to control the disease in moments where there's a risk of it flaring up. And so that's kind of what led us to do this work. And of course, that's a younger version of me, clearly, right? Doing this work in these communities, we've kind of felt like we needed to go into the communities to kind of get a sense of what were their experiences with the coffee rust. We did a variety of focus group discussions, household surveys. We did archival research as well to see how the industry responded to different diseases over time and so on. And kind of what we saw was that clearly there was a problem. Like each year it was getting worse. And this is just based on farmer perception. Farmers were very much aware of the disease. And I can't go into great detail here, but this is a fascinating disease, right? Rust, in terms of its ability to reproduce itself. And its resilience as a disease, as a plant pathogen. I guess the takeaway from this project for us is, while we went in with the intention of developing this early warning system, that we were going to then provide kind of these forecasts to these farmers, that they would be able to then take that and then make these really smart, climate smart decisions and so on. I think as soon as we started doing the work, we realized that wouldn't work, right? It was kind of obvious that farmers were like, yeah, this disease is clearly a problem, but that's not the only problem we have to face, right? And we had what we call these climate services workshops, where we were kind of like just literally sitting down with farmers, talking about their own experiences over the years. We were able to kind of create these calendar of events that show the amount of different shocks that they've experienced over like 20-year period, right? Really developing like an oral history. And what we realized was that this industry has always been facing crises. Like it's a crisis-ridden industry. It has always had different diseases that have emerged over time, and the policy decision has always been to kind of hunker down, force these farmers to stay with this particular variety through all type of different kind of technological fixes. And this was just another part of that story. And what farmers were telling us is that they wanted to switch out of this Arabica typica variety, that they knew that there were other varieties that were more tolerant of this leaf rust, but in some ways they were unable to do so because they weren't being given the support. And that actually forced the team to step back a bit. We wouldn't consider this a failed project, but we didn't develop an early warning system for the leaf rust. Instead, what took place was that the IRI started to focus a lot of its energy on the local meteorological service to kind of beef up their capacity to provide just general climate information to the communities. And my group, which is made up of folks from the UII and University of Arizona, really started doing a lot of work around the kind of more social, political context to kind of understand the disease. And what we kind of ended up deciding was that this is almost like a neoliberal disease, right? The disease itself was co-produced partly by the policies that were put in place by the industry that favored this particular crop that itself was highly susceptible to a range of diseases. And having a kind of a climate science component was great, but there was a need to kind of really address some of these root causes. And so we've been applying for grants. We just applied for a diocese grant, and we're hoping that with that we'll be able to do what we call these resilience workshops, where we'll have different members of the industry meeting to kind of really rethink the future of the industry, beyond just focusing on one market, beyond just focusing on a single variety, to kind of think of other scenarios that we could kind of tap into. And so I'm pretty much going to just kind of end my talk really by just reflecting on the key takeaways from that project. Happy to talk some more about it, but obviously I don't have enough time. But we've published, I think, 4 or 5 papers on this, so I'm happy to share that with folks if you're interested in it. So what we've seen is that there's a need to shift the emphasis of climate information services from just basic packaging of existing climate data to actually addressing more pressing social and economic concerns, right? So climate science is important, but it's not an end in and of itself. It's a means to an end, and we have to think about it in that broader sense. And of course, social context and wider political economies matter. as much as biophysical processes. And we also need to take better account of the role of power structures and how they influence vulnerability and adaptation outcomes, right? So if we weren't aware of these kind of broader institutional factors, we would have missed the beat. We would have provided an early warning system, and we would assume that that early warning system would be sufficient. It would not generate the type of outcome that we expected, and then we would have blamed that on the smallholder farmers again to say, well, they weren't able to take up that technology. So I'll stop there just to kind of give some space for Q&A, but thanks again thanks for listening. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Kevon. So for those of you online, have access to the Zoom questions if they come in. In the meantime, I'll open up for questions here in person. And as we've been doing, it would be great if the first question was from either a student or a postdoc. And we can take our time. Kevon's talked for a while. Well, just wait for the mic so our friends in virtual land can hear us.
I want to preface this question by saying I'm asking this question sort of to see if there's another layer to the findings from the first case study with the perception of droughts from farmers, which was your avenue for gauging local perception of what's happening versus like reduced precipitation or higher temperatures as an indicator of drought. So I guess intuitively I would have assumed the farmers would be able to pick up on those things. And so are there other takeaways that, apart from this simple correlation of the meteorological observation and beyond like the local perception, like is there something more that we can draw from that?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And I think in terms of so that case study obviously is looking at the perceptions and how it matches, how those perceptions matched onto the kind of data that was collected. But one of the kind of big takeaway outside of that correlation was that the timing of the dry season was much more important than the duration and intensity of it. And the reason for that was that we realized that farmers, once they detect that there is a dry season, they prepare for it and they draw on whatever resources they have. The challenge that many of those farmers were facing was that they were depending on either what they kind of anticipated from previous seasons in terms of when the actual dry season was going to come into play. And what that meant was that once that event started, they had to try and draw on their available resources, which many of these farmers, as you can imagine, they don't have like resources waiting on them. And so a lot of these farmers, for instance, would get help from remittances, from family members that live overseas, and so on. And so the timing of the dry season was actually more important than actually the duration of it. Why this is important is that a lot of the efforts that have been done over the years have been really looking at things like SPIs, using SPIs and kind of creating these specific time scales. And a lot of these time scales are missing the beat because these time scales are based on 15th of March to 15th of July. When for a lot of these farmers, it's those kind of the slight changes between the year-to-year dry seasons was much more important to them than the kind of more aggregated kind of vision that a lot of these tools are providing. So that's where, and I'm sorry I didn't go into great detail in that, but that's where I was saying the temporal dynamics matter. And I think it kind of connects with the previous talk that was provided. We were kind of thinking about which scale to use, right, in terms of understanding climate phenomena. And really kind of really centering that in the kind of day-to-day practices that these farmers we're carrying out, I'm kind of making the argument that that's equally as important in kind of deciding what that time scale should be, as opposed to just like doing it independently of these communities.
We have 1 and 2 more questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Rhiney, for the presentation. Want to invite you to reflect a little bit more on kind of the position of the university-based researcher in this type of work, because it gets so helpful the way you presented these case studies that clearly show, right, how much knowledge is being produced by communities, in this case, right, communities of farmers, and thinking through their own sorts of adaptation and climate adaptation and whatnot. And so would love to just hear you reflect a little bit more, say, if communities are already generating knowledge about their own situation and kind of have their own agency in making sense of, making meaning of, and responding to those sorts of climate pressures and changes. I would love to hear you reflect a little bit more on kind of the role of us, in a sense, right? University-based researchers, scholars, teachers in this type of work.
Yeah. Thank you for that, because part of community-based scholarship is really to kind of center the knowledges that we produce with the communities that we're working with. One of the things that I've been particularly interested in is to push back on some of the taken for granted claims, particularly in terms of thinking about smallholder farmers as passive agents, as unable to take on new forms of technologies, as unable to be partners in projects. What my study has shown is that that's far from the truth, that there's a lot that we can learn from local communities, from the kind of experiences and knowledge that is created from these communities in ways that can really enhance the type of scientific work that we're doing. And so in many ways, our role, I think, as scholars, as scientists, is in kind of really creating meaningful partnerships with these communities to kind of create different models that are not just based on top-down, the kind of traditional top-down, conventional ways in which we've done things, to really kind of radically rethink how we do our research. And I think there's a lot of benefit in that. And I think actually we are moving towards that. I think there's especially with indigenous, you've seen it with indigenous scholarship, there's a lot of focus in terms of co-production of knowledge and so on. But I want to center what that co-production should look like. What does participation actually look like? Is it just simply a kind of a tokenistic kind of way of incorporating communities, but not really, creating deep partnerships that's meaningful for both sides? And that's not just an extractivist practice on our end. So I think that's kind of where I would say I think our role is as scientists, to really kind of rethink the models, to rethink the way in which we've carried out our research.
So when Chang has a question.
Thank you for a nice talk. My question is, in the second study, so what kind of weather and climate conditions are responsible for the coffee disease? And also if this weather and climate conditions have strong link with like major climate modes in the system, like ANSO.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So Emilia vastatrix is a fungal pathogen, and so it's driven by a range of different weather parameters. So humidity, for instance, is a huge factor. When you have high humidity, it tends that is one environment in which the fungal pathogen flourishes. There are temperature thresholds that's important in terms of thinking about the pathogen as well, and rainfall distribution. So where you have a humid, wet, moist environment, that's kind of, in a very simple way, that's kind of conducive for the pathogen to flourish. And so if you could develop a kind of a these indicators, drawing on these different parameters, you can probably provide an early warning system based on of those parameters. There's a lot more I can go into with this disease. I mean, it's one of the most aggressive coffee diseases in the world, and it's now has the only place that it wasn't, it didn't exist was Hawaii, and that changed a few years ago. So it now has a global reach, and a lot of folks are thinking that with under a warmer climate, it's going to be more. The conditions for the disease to flourish are going to increase, and so you can have more breakouts under a warmer climate. So yeah, I don't know if that's sufficient. But,
Thank you.
yeah.
So, and I'm going to take an opportunity. So, you know, one of the interpretations, or one of my interpretations of your bullets over here, would be somewhat negative from the point of view of climate scientists, that sort of these social, economic, historical factors are so dominant in setting the vulnerability of certain parts of, in this case, Jamaica, to climate perturbations, that sort of improved understanding of climate and weather are not really relevant in that, and so that from the point of view of me and when I want to be useful in the world is negative. However, from your answer to Paul's question, it made me wonder if it's not that we're not relevant, but maybe that, you know, the tradition, you know, we understand temperature, we understand humidity, we understand degree heating days and length of drought, and that's what we build understanding about. But maybe there are other parameters that we should be focusing on, and maybe what informs the parameters we should be focusing on are maybe the sort of conversations with people that have experience with what matters to them. I mean, that, you know, in the sense of helping us sort of focus our classic scientific attention, that would be an interesting way to center the indigenous knowledge, where somebody would be able to say, listen, I love temperature, but that's not what matters. What matters is the timing of the first dry day or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's what I want you to take from it. Not that climate science doesn't matter. I think socializing climate science might be one way you can think about it, but like really rethinking some of the conventional ways in which we've carried out climate science. And I think not to take away from climate science, but to add to it. I think a lot of this is going to enhance the work that we do. And climate change is a multifaceted, complex problem that requires interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work. And I think one of the challenges is how we can work across disciplines. So as a climate scientist, how can you work with a social scientist in ways that can improve the work that you do, and vice versa, because I benefit a lot from working with climate scientists. So I think that's kind of the big messages that I'm trying to send out, that we need to, in some ways, rethink some of the ways in which we carry out our work, but also things like community partnerships and interdisciplinary research is key if we're going to address this problem of climate change that is so multifaceted and complex that no single discipline can address this problem on its own.
And so I received a warning before the seminar started that we were going to cut this at 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon because Kevon is popular and he needs to go to another seminar. So with this, I would like to you to join me again in thanking Kevon once more. And this is the final seminar for spring 2024, but fall 2024 follows spring 2024 very predictably. So look in your emails and you will see invitations to the next coming seminar series soon. All right, and thank you very much.